Will come to order. I note that a quorum is present. Without objection, the chair may declare a recess at any time. The meeting record will remain open for 5 legislative days, so members may submit any materials they wish to be included herein. Thank you, Ranking Member Sewell and members of the subcommittee for joining us today. As the former Florida Secretary of State and Chief Elections Official, I am passionate about ensuring that every state administers safe and secure elections and that voters across America have confidence in our elections system. Each member of this subcommittee brings unique experience with elections, and I look forward to the work we can accomplish together. I believe both the Republicans and Democrats have a common goal of ensuring that every eligible American citizen has an opportunity to vote and for their ballot to be counted and to be secure. Each of our states share many of the same challenges, and we will work together to ensure we're addressing cyber and physical infrastructure, emergency management strategies, and that we provide insight to states across America about best practices and tried and true methods for conducting secure and accurate elections. Where we see states succeeding, we will shine a light on their important work. And where we see states falling short, we will work to bring transparency to their challenges and to serve as a resource to help improve their elections process. While we may not always agree about the best policies to implement or recommend to the states, I am confident in our ability to promote our shared interests and to always work professionally and efficiently together. The Constitution tells us that states, not the federal government, have primary authority and responsibility to set election laws and to administer federal elections. To that end, I am pleased to welcome today's witnesses from Ohio, Louisiana, and Florida, 3 states that are getting elections right and can share some of the policies and practices that have led to their success. It's important to hear from them about what their states are doing well. As a member from Florida, I am the first to acknowledge that our state didn't always run smooth elections. Most people here will still be familiar with the infamous Hanging Chad election of 2000. But over the last 2 decades, we've continued to identify areas for improvement and led the way to addressing those issues without top-down mandates from Washington, D.C. Today, Florida has an effective and thorough elections code, procedures, and safeguards. I'm proud that Florida is now a national leader in election administration and is an example of how continual review and improvement can lead to sustained success in elections integrity and administration. Data shows that after some states implement key election integrity measures, they experience increased voter turnout. That's why I think a great place to start this discussion is by reflecting on the 2022 midterms that just occurred, where elections administration was performed at a very high level. I'd like to applaud the vast majority of states and localities for their work. We should celebrate those states, like those represented here today, that have continually found ways to improve their process and to build voter turnout and voter confidence. It's simple. When voters have confidence that their ballot will count, they are more likely to vote. In Georgia, following efforts to increase voter confidence through Senate Bill 202, after lessons learned in previous years, there was all-time record turnout for a midterm election, with more votes cast than in any previous midterm. Despite enduring criticisms of election integrity measures and aspersions claiming that election turnout would be suppressed by reforms, Georgia had record-breaking midterm early voting turnout, record-breaking midterm absentee votes cast, and more Election Day votes cast in the 2022 runoff than on Election Day in the 2022 general election, the January 2021 runoff, or on General Election Day in 2020. In Louisiana, their midterms featured several strong voter integrity measures, like requiring photo identification to vote in person, and the state offering to provide free voter ID for voters that did not have one, not to mention the state's efforts to conduct elections during hurricane season. Ohio just signed into law key election integrity measures, including requiring photo ID to vote both in person and by absentee mail ballot. And now they're working to improve transparency even more. These are all huge wins for voters, and these efforts should be celebrated. Over the past 20 years, we've seen distrust in our elections processes and outcomes on both sides of the aisle. And while this will always be a process with room for improvement, it's important that we take a moment to celebrate the successes many states have achieved over the past several years to build election integrity and promote voters' faith in elections and confidence in their outcomes, while also working to promote voter turnout and engagement. We will work wherever possible to share accurate information with the public about elections and the integrity of our process. And as all our states learn how to better serve their voters through improvements and efforts in elections administration, this committee should promote information sharing between the states so they can learn from each other and implement best practices regarding elections without pushing a DC-based takeover or mandates. I look forward to hearing more from our witnesses about how states can continue to strengthen our nation's elections together. Through collaboration and commitment to effective policies and voter education, we can strengthen our nation's elections infrastructure and work toward building confidence in the security of each state's elections, the strength of our infrastructure, and the integrity of our results. I now recognize Ranking Member Ms. Sewell for 5 minutes for the purpose of providing an opening statement.
Good morning. As the new ranking member of the Subcommittee on Elections, I would like to thank Chairwoman Lee for welcoming all of us this morning, and I look forward to working with her and all of my fellow colleagues on this subcommittee. Providing oversight over federal election administration and ensuring every American has free and equitable access to the ballot is vital to our democracy. I represent Alabama's 7th Congressional District, a district with a long, storied history in this country's struggle for free and fair access to the ballot box. I get to represent every day the historic cities of Birmingham, Montgomery, and my hometown of Selma, Alabama. I'm excited to join the subcommittee and continue this critical work. Last week, we marked the 58th anniversary of Bloody Sunday in my hometown of Selma with a visit from President Biden, a bipartisan delegation of members of Congress, civil rights leaders, and many of the surviving foot soldiers of the march from Selma to Montgomery. This annual pilgrimage serves as a reminder that the violent struggle for voting rights and equal access to the ballot box is not one of a distant past. As we sit here today discussing the 2022 midterm elections, we must not lose sight of the fact that the struggle for equal voting rights that occurred on the Edmund Pettus Bridge 58 years ago continues today. There are successes, to be sure, in the 2022 midterms. Millions of Americans cast their ballots. Those ballots were counted, and election workers across the nation performed admirably despite the threats and harassments that many face over the last 2 years. The election was secure, as it was in 2020. Those who continue to perpetuate the big lie that the last presidential election was stolen and who traffic in falsehoods about the security of our elections lost many of their races for critical statewide offices. Furthermore, according to the Brennan Center for Justice, in 2022, at least 12 states enacted laws that expanded access to the vote. On the opposite side of the spectrum, however, the Brennan Center found that another 12 states enacted restrictive or election interference legislation. We should applaud increases in voter turnout, not respond to them with new restrictions to voting. Additionally, while many minority communities overcome barriers to cast their ballots, it does not make their barriers fair, and it certainly does not justify or validate their existence. In the years since the Supreme Court's egregious decision in the Shelby versus Holder's decision, states with a history of voter discrimination are no longer required to pre-clear their voting laws to ensure that they are not discriminatory, allowing a wave of anti-voter laws to be adopted across this nation. Today, the Supreme Court continues to dismantle the Voting Rights Act of 1965. I am proud to be the lead co-sponsor, or the lead sponsor and author of the John Robert Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, a bill that would update and reinstate the full force of the Voting Rights Act of 1965, a law that protected voters from discrimination for more than 50 years. Additionally, House Democrats have repeatedly passed pro-democracy legislation that will protect voters' access to the ballot box. Generations of Americans fought for the sacred right to vote, many in my district, overcoming barriers and violence to move us forward in this fight for democracy. The people of Alabama and this country have marched, bled, been jailed, some even died for that sacred right to vote that all of us are entrusted to make sure occurs. The work as members of Congress and as members of this committee will honor that legacy. I look forward to the hearing today. I look forward to working with the chairwoman and the whole of this committee as we continue to lean forward in making sure that the equal right to vote and access to the ballot box for all Americans is given. Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you. I now recognize full committee chair Brian Stile for the purpose of delivering opening remarks.
Thank you very much, Chair Lee. I just want to congratulate you on holding your first subcommittee hearing today. I can't think of anyone better to serve as chair of this subcommittee with your background in the state of Florida, an election system that is now really the gold standard for the United States. In Ranking Member Sewell, an affinity for that position as I sat as the ranking member in this committee last cycle. I would say there's a high bar, though. The minority last Congress had unanimous votes the entire duration of the Congress. Now, as some may know, that was easier said than done because I was the only member of the minority on this committee last Congress. So I can say I never disagreed with myself. But Mr. Butterfield and I did have a great relationship. I think we have an opportunity here to find some real common ground on areas where we can make it easy to vote and hard to cheat. There will also be some probably robust conversations where we will disagree. But this committee, in my opinion, is the oldest committee in Congress. We can have our debates, and I know my friend from Ways and Means may view it otherwise, but I do think it's this committee because this committee, the Committee on Elections, was created in 1789 as the first standing committee of the first Congress. I think that's pretty great because it shows you the significance and importance of the work that we do here. And in a serious sense, I really do look forward to working with everyone to continue to identify ways to bolster confidence, promote faith in our elections, and strengthen election integrity. I think one of the things that we really see is the data shows is that when we have strong elections, strong integrity in our elections, we actually see increased voter turnout. I think that's going to be something that we're going to hear time and time again throughout this Congress. When people know they can trust their ballot's going to be counted, they're going to be more likely to go and vote. And also, we know the Constitution demands that the role of the federal government is limited in this regard. It makes it clear that states have the primary role in administering elections, and we must uphold that federalist approach. So today we'll hear from witnesses who help run state elections in Louisiana, Ohio, and Florida, and states that do things right. And I hope to learn from their example and look forward to having House Administration, specifically this subcommittee, help facilitate those discussions. Thanks, Chair Lee. I yield back.
I now recognize full committee ranking member Mr. Morelli for the purpose of delivering opening remarks.
Good morning. Thank you so much, Chairwoman Lee, not only for yielding time, but for convening this important discussion. Unlike the standing chair, Mr. Stile, I often disagree with myself, so I would not be unanimous if I were the only member, but I'm grateful for the opportunity to be here and want to also thank my dear friend and the ranking member, Terry Sewell. It's great to have you leading our efforts on this important subcommittee, so thank you. After the last 2 years' baseless claims of fraud and repeated attacks on our democracy, it is important to recognize the 2022 election was secure and applaud the country's election officials for their hard work. Elections and democracy do not function without them, and for far too many and in far too many places, those election workers have faced a shameful amount of harassment and threats, something we should all be deeply concerned about. As we examine the 2022 election, it's also important to highlight that many states took steps forward to expand access to the ballot. I'm proud to say that in my home state of New York, we've made significant strides in recent years to improve and expand access to the ballot for every voter. And there is zero evidence that the pro-voter policies put in place in my state have in any way compromised the security or the integrity of those elections. Last Congress, I was proud to co-sponsor and vote for H.R. 1, the For the People Act, which would have set national standards for voter access and required a host of pro-voter, pro-democracy reforms. That's what we should be all about, pro-voter, pro-democracy reforms. I was also proud to co-sponsor and vote for H.R. 4, the John R. Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, which Ranking Member Sewell's sponsored, and her bill to reinstate the full force of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. If we truly wish to be a great democracy, we can and must be committed to expanding access to the ballot for every single American. The committee's role in conducting oversight of federal elections is critical. We must continue to fight to protect our elections, improve access to the ballot for every voter, and ensure states and localities have the funding and resources necessary to conduct elections freely, fairly, and securely, to combat the continued spread of election-related mis- and disinformation, and ensure the safety of election workers and voters. American democracy persevered in the 2022 election, but more progress is needed to protect our institutions from election denialism and attempts to invalidate lawfully cast votes. And I look forward to today's hearing, and certainly look forward to hearing from our witnesses, the discussion that I'm sure will ensue, as well as the discussion in the months ahead. And so I'm grateful for the opportunity to say a few words, and with that, Madam Chair, I yield back.
Without objection, all other members' opening statements will be made part of the hearing record if they are submitted to the committee clerk by 5 p.m. today. Pursuant to paragraph B of Committee Rule 6, the witnesses will please stand and raise your right hand. Do you solemnly swear or affirm that the testimony that you are about to give is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? I do. Let the record show that the witnesses answered in the affirmative, and they may be seated. Our first witness, Secretary Kyle Ardoin, serves as Louisiana's 44th Secretary of State. Secretary Ardoin previously served as president of the National Association of Secretaries of State, currently serves on the Election Infrastructure Subsector Government Coordinating Council, and became a certified elections registration administrator in 2021. He brings to the Secretary's office more than 30 years of experience working in both the private and public sectors. Our next witness, Mr. Chris Anderson, was appointed by Florida Governor Ron DeSantis as the Supervisor of Elections for Seminole County in January of 2019. In 2020, Mr. Anderson was elected to office as the first African-American constitutional officer in the history of Seminole County. Enlisting in the U.S. Army following 9/11 terrorist attacks, Mr. Anderson retired as a combat veteran of Operation Enduring Freedom and became a deputy sheriff. I now yield to my House Administration colleague, Mr. Carey of Ohio, for the purpose of introducing our next witness, Ohio Secretary of State, Mr. LaRose.
Thank you, Madam Chair and Ranking Member. Appreciate the opportunity to be on the subcommittee today. But really just honored that I'm able to introduce my dear friend, the Ohio Secretary of State, Frank LaRose. Frank has dedicated his life to public service. After graduating from high school, he enlisted in the United States Army, and he became a decorated combat veteran. He is a U.S. Army Special Forces Green Beret and earned a Bronze Star for his service in Iraq. Before he was elected as Secretary of State, Frank served in the Ohio Senate from 2011 and 2018. As somebody who often went into his office in the State Senate, I always found him to be very engaging and asking many, many questions. Frank has overseen many unprecedented challenges as Secretary of State of Ohio. The 2020 election took place during a global pandemic, and even so, it had the highest voter turnout in Ohio's history. Frank is a patriot, a revered public servant, and he will be a great witness for us to learn more about what we can do to make our elections safe, secure, so that voters remain confident in the election system. Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Carey. And finally, we welcome Mr. Damon Hewitt, President and Executive Director of the Lawyers Committee. Prior to joining the Lawyers Committee, Mr. Hewitt served as inaugural Executive Director of the Executives Alliance for Boys and Men of Color and as an attorney at the NAACP Legal Defense and Education Fund for over a decade. We appreciate each of our witnesses for being here today, your expertise, your experience, and your service in the realm of elections, and we look forward to your testimony. As a reminder, we have read your written statement and it will appear in full in the hearing record. Under Committee Rule 9, you are to limit your oral presentation to a brief summary of your written statement, unless I extend this time period in consultation with Ranking Member Sewell. Please remember to press the button on the microphone in front of you so that it is on and the members can hear you. When you begin to speak, the light in front of you will turn green. After 4 minutes, the light will turn yellow. When the red light comes on, your 5 minutes has expired, and we would ask that you please wrap up. I now recognize Secretary Ardwine for 5 minutes.
Chairwoman Lee, Ranking Member Sewell, and distinguished members of this committee, good morning and thank you for having me here today. I'm especially pleased to be speaking before you today because Louisiana has unique experience in election preparation that lend itself to successful execution of our 2020, 2021, and 2022 statewide elections. In 2020, not only did Louisiana face the challenges of COVID-19 pandemic, but we also had to contend with several hurricanes and tropical storms in a major election cycle, the last of which made landfall just 6 days before the presidential election. In 2021, we had to contend with another major storm, Hurricane Ida, which made landfall in southeast Louisiana 6 weeks prior to a statewide election. The damage caused by Ida was so widespread and severe that we were forced to reschedule the election. Thankfully, we developed a contingency plan in 2020 called Operation Go Vote, which gave our office, election workers, and partners across the state the tools necessary to successfully implement these major elections. In fact, despite the storms and ongoing pandemic, over 70.1% of eligible voters in Louisiana participated in the presidential election. Since 2014, Louisiana has successfully carried out 9 statewide elections in a row. This track record of success was once again on display in the 2022 congressional midterm elections, where we were able to roll back our COVID restrictions and thankfully did not have to contend with any major storms. As usual, we finalized the tabulation of results in a matter of hours. Consistency is why the Louisiana Legislative Auditor released a 45-page report just last year, which confirmed the effectiveness of our policies and procedures. The report stated overall, quote, overall, we found the Department of State has procedures and practices to ensure election integrity, end quote. The policies they cite, in addition to my office's work with the legislature, have been vital in promoting integrity and efficiency in Louisiana's elections. We have worked to pass legislation that banned ballot harvesting, provides more accurate data from Louisiana Department of Health to conduct more accurate audits of our voter rolls, and strengthening the testing of our voting equipment. Further, I'm happy to say that Louisianans overwhelmingly voted in favor of a constitutional amendment in December of last year that prohibits non-citizens from registering or voting in any election in our state. Participation in our democracy is both a right of American citizens and a tremendous responsibility for those that exercise it. It is how we as Americans exercise political power over our government, our nation, and ultimately each other. As citizens, we rely on the assumption that those who have a say over how we govern ourselves are our fellow citizens. That is why the practice of non-citizen voting is particularly egregious. It is wrong in principle and in practice. It could open the door for foreign nationals with no loyalty to our communities and our country to exercise political power over our fellow citizens. These types of laws have the potential to irreparably weaken one of the strongest ties that binds us together as a nation. Even the Washington Post editorial board agrees. Our state utilizes a top-down approach to the administration, preparation, and execution of its elections, whereby our policies and procedures are set in the Secretary of State's office and flow downstream to the registrars of voters and the clerks of court in all 64 parishes. This gives Louisiana much-needed uniformity in our elections. Whether a voter is in St. Bernard Parish, Beauregard Parish, or Bossier Parish, they will be voting on the same system, in the same manner, with the same procedures for tabulation and reporting. This top-down approach to elections is what allowed us to have over 1.4 million votes tabulated within 5 hours of poll closure on election night in 2022. It is this system that keeps Louisianans from having to wait 2 weeks to learn who their elected representatives are going to be. Despite the resources available to election officials, it took some states days and weeks to tabulate their results. This, in turn, has created space for some to question the integrity of their state's elections. As election officials, we have to get it right the very first time, every time. Any deviation from that standard risks losing the trust of the voters. That trust is the lifeblood of our democracy. The best way for officials to counter claims of fraud or interference is to leave no room for doubt. Zero room for doubt gives voters every reason to trust their elections and our democracy.
Thank you, Secretary Ardoin. I now recognize Supervisor Anderson for 5 minutes.
Good morning, Chair Lee, to Ranking Member Sewell, and to all the distinguished members of the committee. Thank you for the opportunity to testify before you today. I'm Chris Anderson. I'm the Supervisor of Elections representing Seminole County, Florida. On November 3rd, 2020, I was elected into office as the first African American to serve in this capacity. I also became the first African American to serve as the first constitutional officer in Seminole County. I'm proud to say that I stand on the shoulders of giants, like my grandmother, Ida Anderson. She was my mother. I was raised by a single father. My grandmother told me stories of how she had to clean old juke joints to make extra money. She told me she had to pick fruit just to put food on the table to feed 5 children. On cold winter days in North Florida, she had to dress especially warm because she wasn't allowed to ride in the front of the trucks because of the color of her skin. She had to ride in the back. It's because of struggles like hers and the struggles of so many others, I'm able to sit here today. And for that, I am grateful. Now, I'd be remiss if I didn't recognize my fellow current and former servicemen and women. Let us not forget that many of them paid or made the ultimate sacrifice for the freedoms that we enjoy. In the words of President Reagan, when our fallen heroes die, they give up 2 lives, the lives that they were living and the lives that they could have lived. They gave up the opportunity to be parents, to be grandparents, to grow old and be revered. Although we can never repay them, we can honor them with our service. And that is why I do everything in my power to make sure that every voter, every eligible voter, has the opportunity to cast a ballot. But I don't do that alone. I have to enlist almost 1,000 election professionals to accomplish that mission. These men and women are among the most dedicated and hardworking professionals I have ever served with. Their commitment to excellence is unparalleled. Their devotion to the voters is inspiring, because I believe that inspiration leads to effective change, and effective change leads to success. And in this case, the success of the 2022 midterm elections. I've watched election professionals sacrifice the most precious moments a family can have in their service to America's democracy. Without these quiet keepers of our democracy, our government would fail. These individuals are beyond dedicated to the election, to the executives in elections administration, to the frontline election professionals. They make our government exist the way it should be, of, by, and for the people. If it's not too much to ask, I'd ask that you all join me in a round of applause for these election professionals, because without them, there would be no success. Without them, there would be no gold standard. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much, Chairwoman
I
Lee.
now recognize Secretary LaRose for 5 minutes.
Got ahead of you. Thank you so much, Chairwoman Lee, and thank you so much, Ranking Member Sewell, as well as all the members of the subcommittee. I want to thank Representative Carey for that generous introduction. My name's Frank LaRose. I'm proud to serve the people of Ohio as their 51st Ohio Secretary of State, and I'm happy to talk with you all today about the things that we're doing in the Buckeye State to keep the ball moving forward. Fair elections, of course, are the foundation of our democratic republic. They serve to document and to certify what Thomas Jefferson called the consent of the governed, that precious permission that the citizens give each and every one of us to serve them as public office holders. Of course, access to and the integrity of our elections is vital to that representative government on which our states and nation have thrived. With integrity comes confidence in the system and a belief by the electorate that each election had a sure winner and a sure loser. Integrity and confidence, they go hand in hand. And yet, our nation faces a crisis of confidence in our elections. Republicans and Democrats alike are losing faith in the electoral system. That hasn't always been the case, and it must end. You've all likely heard the phrase, as goes Ohio, so goes the nation. For decades, the Buckeye State has served as one of the nation's bellwethers when it comes to elections. With that moniker comes intensive scrutiny and attention. That spotlight that we've been under, the kind of scrutiny and attention that empowered Ohio to implement election protocols that have made our state a gold standard for conducting elections. Over the past 2 decades, Ohio has never rested on our laurels. The only way to stay ahead of the curve is with innovation, continuous improvement. With the crisis of confidence our nation now faces, immediate action is now required. So Ohio is stepping up to the bat once again with 2 significant advancements designed to strengthen that public trust. I look forward to sharing those advancements with you today. First, a focus on strengthening election transparency through technology. More than 60 years ago, Congress enacted the Civil Rights Act of 1960, seeking in part to prevent acts of voter suppression and discrimination through the retention of paper election records. The idea was simple: to allow for the scrutiny of election-related records so that the public could ensure that lawful votes weren't being altered or stolen. This requirement established a tradition of transparency that has served to protect the voting rights of all Americans for decades. The problem, however, lies in the fact that this legislation was written, of course, in an analog era. It resulted in a patchwork of state and local practices that have not kept pace with modern technology or the expectations of the public. States have done little, if anything, to codify the retention of electronic election records. They lack consistent standards for defining important election data, and they've never set clear guidelines on how and for how long that electronic voter data should be stored, or even whether or how it should be disclosed for analysis. A comparative analysis with colleagues in other states finds antiquated, inconsistent data retention practices that fall considerably short of the transparency we all expect, and in many cases, election officials update their records by simply saving over old data. What this does is it oftentimes causes confusion and lack of transparency. In other cases, efforts to clean the rolls may even result in making things more confusing. As the Secretary of State in one of the nation's biggest political battlegrounds, I'm leading an effort to change this. Working with our state legislature, we've introduced legislation that we call the Data Act. It codifies key election definitions and retention requirements for voter registration and for the records of ballots cast. I'm asking my colleagues in other states to consider using this legislation as a framework for their own reforms, and together we can adopt uniform standards that will increase the trust that people have because of the transparency that we have in our elections. Second, an innovation that we've brought to Ohio recently is called the Public Integrity Division. A review of our office's capabilities demonstrated that there was room to strengthen the investigative function far beyond what they were. For too long, questions of election law violations or campaign finance violations were left up to election clerks, dedicated and purposeful individuals, but people that were not trained as law enforcement professionals and didn't know how to conduct a professional investigation. Demonstrating integrity comes with the very direct and positive impact of increasing participation in our elections. And that's what our Public Integrity Division is all about, investigating those rare instances of voter fraud so that we can keep them rare and increase the trust that people have in our elections. In Ohio, where our efforts have maintained the confidence of voters, we're seeing great success both in turnout and in participation. And that's something that we're proud of in the Buckeye State. And I look forward to your questions.
I now recognize Mr. Hewitt for 5 minutes.
Good morning, Chairwoman Lee, Ranking Member Sewell, and members of the Subcommittee on Elections. My name is Damon Hewitt. I'm President and Executive Director of the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law. I thank you for the chance to testify today about the successes and challenges of the 2022 midterm elections. Our organization litigates voting rights cases extensively. We also convene the nation's largest voter protection effort, the Election Protection Coalition, over 300 organizations nationwide. We also administer the 866 Our Vote hotline, where thousands of volunteer attorneys every year field calls from assistance from voters nationwide. Our litigation, our advocacy, our partnerships in the field, and our firsthand accounts from hundreds of thousands of voters from all across this nation tell a story, and they inform my testimony today. They tell a story of progress yet continued peril with respect to our elections infrastructure. Any notion of success of the 2022 midterm elections must be put into context in order to understand the fragility of our democratic system and the ongoing efforts to undermine it. Last weekend, I was in Selma, Alabama, participating in the annual Bridge Crossing Jubilee, honoring the sacrifice of those who were attacked on Bloody Sunday in 1965. I marched across the Edmund Pettus Bridge. I joined some of the original foot soldiers, and also joined Ranking Member Sewell as well. We were marching for justice, we were marching for voting rights. Now, the eventually successful march in 1965 after Bloody Sunday put a spotlight of moral clarity on the denial of the right to vote and helped to usher in the Voting Rights Act of 1965, the most transformative piece of legislation this nation perhaps has ever seen. Nearly 60 years later, people from all walks of life continue to march across that bridge because they know and they do not want America to forget that the right to vote is still under attack today. The 2022 midterms made one thing crystal clear. The measure of success must not only be how many people were able to vote. Certainly there were impressive numbers in many jurisdictions, but we must also do an analysis of which people were able to vote and the types of barriers they had to overcome in order to do so. Black voters and other voters of color continue to face unnecessary obstacles to casting a ballot. At the bridge crossing this year, we encountered so many amazing people, volunteers who saw burdensome laws that make it harder to register to vote, voters who encounter unnecessary hurdles themselves, and even election administrators who marched with us who have received threats simply for trying to do their job in good faith, those everyday heroes. The Lawyers Committee stands with them as we all carry the burden of keeping our democracy running, and we expend significant time, effort, and resources to do so. Last year, defenders of democracy were forced to jam our fingers into the door of democracy to keep that door open, whereas so many state legislatures sought to slam that door shut. We've seen in the last couple of years laws at the state level that ban drop boxes, restrict early voting hours, shorten the number of days voters can request absentee ballots, threaten new criminal and financial penalties against those election administrators, those heroes. Counterintuitive. These were all efforts we believe designed to erect barriers to voting, not to make voting easier. In many cases, these laws were made possible and even popular by the Supreme Court's decision in Shelby County versus Holder in 2013, which essentially gutted the strongest provision of the Voting Rights Act, the preclearance provision. To overcome these barriers, so many thousands of advocates at the Lawyers Committee and our allied organizations around the country had to scramble to provide accurate, nonpartisan, reliable information to voters regarding their ability and eligibility to cast a ballot. Election administrators had to develop new materials under serious time constraints because of these newly changed rules. And also, we all had to battle rampant misinformation and disinformation from across the board. Just this week, the Lawyers Committee won summary judgment in a lawsuit in federal court involving robocalls sent to black voters, targeting them, telling them that if they vote by mail, that the information will be used to execute outstanding warrants, to track them down to collect outstanding debts, and also to force mandatory vaccinations. The same individuals who perpetrated this horror were also prosecuted in a couple of different states. But the problems have not abated. We have to continue to be vigilant. Another thing to note about the 2022 midterms is the widening gap in participation. This is one of the key indicators under the Voting Rights Act. We've seen gaps of 13% in Georgia, 16% in North Carolina, and a whopping 35% in Ohio. This is not success. Democracy demands more. This is no time to claim mission accomplished. We have work to do. Thank you for your questions.
Thank you. I'll begin our questions today, followed by the ranking member, and we will then alternate between the parties. So I now recognize myself for the purpose of questioning our witnesses. Thank you, Secretary Ardoin and Secretary Laurel, for joining us here today for our first election subcommittee hearing of the 118th Congress. It is always nice to hear from my former colleagues from NAS about their state successes and best practices. And of course, Supervisor Anderson, it is a true pleasure to have part of our Florida team that is so very unified around the state with our shared goal of elections administration. So I am just thrilled to have all of our witnesses here with us today. Secretary Ardoin, I'd like to start with you. One of the things that is a common challenge for elections officials around our country is the concept of emergency management and emergency preparedness. In your opening remarks, you made reference to something that in Louisiana you refer to as Operation Go Vote that is related to hurricane preparedness. Would you please share with us a little bit more about what that program is and how it works?
Absolutely, and I just want to say that we spell it G-E-A-U-X, like Go Tigers. And so we had a really good year this year in football. So I think that's what kept the Hurricanes away from us this round. But Chairwoman Lee, what we did was when we realized in 2020 we were going to have significant issues, I called upon our retired Adjutant General of the National Guard who had just retired and asked him if he would assist us in preparing for the election, for the presidential, knowing we couldn't move the presidential election. We can't move any federal election. And luckily, he had been through Katrina and other natural disasters. He immediately said yes. And what we did was, under his leadership, we set up a task force within our agency, agency-wide, both the elections division, the IT division, the procurement division, et cetera. And we had a weekly meeting, and we set goals and we set strategic operational needs, and then we worked on that, and we were able to also work with our state partners and our federal partners. Unfortunately, after Hurricane Ida, we weren't able to work with our state partners, and our federal partners didn't come to any aid for us. So we were on our own. But it was that strategic move and that stability of having already operated it. So I called upon my IT director, who had just finished serving in Guantanamo Bay. He's an active Coast Guard reservist, and they were called onto it. So I called him in, and we still utilize General Curtis as a consultant. But once we had the initial task force set up, we knew what to do internally. It took us a lot more work after Ida, but that is I think a best practice that other states might want to look at because it was very strategic. We were able to get more resources, and the communication was the most important of what we needed, how we needed to get it, and all hands on deck.
Thank you. My next question, Supervisor Anderson. One thing that I know that was implemented in Florida was something called the Joint Election Security Initiative, which was really the first of its kind partnership where state and local election officials worked together, not just by sharing information and best practices, but truly to integrate the cybersecurity risk assessments and review of our statewide infrastructure to strengthen the cybersecurity and physical posture of that infrastructure. Would you please share with us a little bit about how that program worked and your assessment of why it is significant?
Absolutely. Thank you for the question. It was a great partnership between the Florida Department of State that was led by then Secretary Laurel, Madam Chair. And it was unprecedented because now all 67 counties were working with the Department of State in strengthening their cybersecurity infrastructure. We had cyber navigators from the Department of State come and meet with our IT professionals. They scanned our networks. They gave us best practices. And I'm very happy to report that in Seminole County, we passed with flying colors. And now we also established the cyber navigators became, they had an area of assignment. So now you had someone that had an expertise in cybersecurity that you could reach out to within your area. This was especially important for those smaller counties in the state of Florida, those more rural counties, because as they will tell you, they have more livestock than they do people. And their budgets are smaller, so they are constrained by what they can purchase and things they can do. So this was something that did not affect their budgets, but was greatly needed to strengthen the cybersecurity of our elections. And I was very proud to participate with the chair in Jesse, as it's called to, and it was unprecedented, and I'm very glad that we got a chance to do it.
And then Secretary Ardoin, back to you, and this is something that I know you and Secretary Laurel, I believe, both share, but I believe Louisiana's program was one of the first of its kind, related to an election integrity unit that was designed to actually identify where there did occur instances of fraud or potentially criminal conduct, a response unit. Would you please tell us about that and how that works in your state?
Yes, ma'am. So I've been in the Secretary of State's office since 2010, and that program is prior to my even becoming First Assistant or Secretary of State. We have what we call, 6 compliance officers. We have them stationed in different parts of the state, different regions, and they are called upon to investigate any allegations of election fraud. We also use them to enforce laws that are on the books, whether it's for access to the polls or preventing individuals who shouldn't be at the polls, for example, people who are campaigning for a candidate. They are very strategic. We don't interfere in the election. Our investigations are sealed until we make a report to the local district attorney, who is the enforcement officer in their districts for any election fraud issues. We investigate anything from a candidate or a group coercing voters to register in the wrong districts. We had a recent case of that where an individual pled out because he was moving people from outside of his district into his district simply by voter registrations. We also conduct investigations and cooperate with our federal partners, and the FBI just made arrests of 2 individuals, current office holder and former office holder, for vote buying. And so we will work with any law enforcement agency in order to make sure that our elections are fair and free of fraud.
All right, thank you. I now recognize Ranking Member Sewell for 5 minutes for the purpose of questioning our witnesses.
Thank you, and I join with Chairwoman Lee in thanking our witnesses for your testimony. Mr. Ardoin, my question, I only have 5 minutes, so simple yes or no answer. Were the 2020 and the 2022 midterm elections in Louisiana fair and secure? Yes or no?
Yes.
Mr. LaRose, were the 2020 and the 2022 elections in Ohio fair and secure?
Yes, ma'am.
Likewise, Mr. Anderson, would you say that in Florida, the 2020 and the 2022 elections were fair and secure?
Absolutely.
So, Mr. Hewitt, my question to you is regarding federal oversight. Now, while it's true that our mandate comes from the Constitution, that the time, manner, and place of elections definitely is in the purview of the states. But it also, the Constitution says, but the Congress may at any time by law or alter such regulations. Since the Shelby versus Holder decision 10 years ago, would you say there have been more restrictive laws passed by states or less? And can you talk about that for a minute?
Without question. I think, we heard it in your opening statement, Ranking Member Sewell, the number of new legislations that we've seen all around the country, and even those that weren't adopted created a climate of fear, a chilling effect, that we want to almost make voting harder for everyone. That's really what the tenor has been. I don't believe that's shared by election professionals, but that certainly is what's shared by the politics. Section 5 was the most powerful part of the Voting Rights Act. That was the prophylactic, right? That was the thing that stopped fires before they happened. Section 2 is kind of like your fire hose, right? And even that has been weakened. The Supreme Court is poking holes in it with decisions in cases like Brnovich. And now, what's before the Supreme Court and threatens to cut the fire hose off altogether. So you'll be holding a hose with no water in it, and the fires will flame. Those fires are exactly what you're talking about, the legislation that is designed to make it more difficult to vote.
My next question, could you elaborate further on why voter turnout alone is not a good indicator of whether or not voting laws are restrictive or discriminatory?
Certainly. We have to go back to the Voting Rights Act at its inception and the formula even throughout the years as it was revised to take a critical look at not just how many people voted overall, but what were their registration rates, what were the racial disparities, and also the disparities in participation. That's what I alluded to in my verbal testimony and also in our written testimony as well, because we're looking at all of the chilling effects, the things that make it harder to vote, the things that may be illegal, but the things that may be legal under state law, but that are designed to frustrate the intent of Congress and the Constitution.
So how has the rise of election denial and the lies about election outcomes contributed to voter intimidation and some of the violence that we even see against poll workers?
It's created extreme confusion, confusion for election administrators at the local level, perhaps at the state level, although colleagues can answer that, and also for the people who try to help voters in a nonpartisan and completely legal way. It creates a climate in which people don't know what the rules are because the rules keep changing and they're going in the wrong direction.
So, Secretary Ardoin, is there rampant voter fraud in Louisiana? Yes or no?
No,
Is it more the exception than the rule?
I believe so.
What about you, Mr. Laurel? Is there rampant voter fraud in your state of Ohio?
Thankfully, no, and we work to keep it rare.
Likewise to you, Mr. Anderson.
No, ma'am.
You know, in my last few minutes, I just want to say that we have an awesome task on this committee to make sure that federal elections are fair and secure. And right now, because the Supreme Court has struck down Holder, Section 5, and now looking at Section 2 with an Alabama case, I think it's important to note that there's no federal oversight of states. And while most states, I would say the majority of the states, do not seek to provide more restrictive laws, but if the effect of it is to discriminate or to make it harder for certain people to vote, we as a body, Congress, needs to step in and make sure that we give the proper oversight. I look forward to working with you, Chairwoman Lee, in not only addressing violence at the polls, voter intimidation, but also when states do enact egregious state laws that actually have the effect of limiting the people to vote, certain people to vote, that we will seek to try to figure out ways that we can have federal oversight to overturn those. Obviously, I think that my bill, the Voting Rights Advancement Act, named after John Lewis, is the right vehicle to do that, but clearly I'm willing to work in a bipartisan manner in which we can put back federal oversight. Thank you, and I yield back the rest of my time.
All right. Thank you, Ranking Member Sewell. I'm just going to share with you a little bit of a logistics update. Apparently, votes have been called, so our committee, we're going to carry on for a few more minutes here with questions, and then we will have to take a recess and return after the members have an opportunity to vote. So at this moment, I now recognize Mr. Loudermilk for 5 minutes for the purpose of questioning our witness.
Well, thank you, Madam Chair, and congratulations on this position. It's well-deserved, and I'm looking forward to working with you throughout this Congress, as well as the members of the minority party. This is an extremely important role. Traditionally, this committee has just been seen as the administrative committee and the parking committee, but as you're seeing now, we're taking a more I'd say aggressive role, or a role in taking our tasks very seriously. Not that it wasn't done in the past, but I think we're in a place now where it's very important that we do look at the role of government, federal government, state government, and especially integrity in our elections. And again, I agree with the things that's been said. This is, according to the Constitution, the states take the predominant role. The federal government's role in that time to time is limited to who can vote more than how they vote. And so we leave that to the states. And I think it's important we set the record straight, especially being from Georgia, as to the 2022 election. And Georgia's new election law was chief among, I think, some of the successes that we saw post-2020 and going into the 2022 elections. And these laws were passed over the past several years. And as a former member of the legislature, I can attest that we have always taken election laws very seriously in Georgia. And there's always going to be some level of fraud. We're never going to eliminate all of it, but we do have to make sure that our elections have the integrity and the people feel that their vote really matters. Unfortunately, there was a lot of falsehoods about Georgia's election law pushed by many, especially many in Washington, D.C., claiming that it was going to create massive voter suppression, which even the Washington Post and other major media outlets identified that these claims were false, even before the election happened. And so, first, let me ask Secretary Laurel, because I understand you may not be able to stay with us through the recess. So, in January this year, Governor DeWine signed House Bill 458, requiring in-person voters to present a photo identification instead of other forms of identification. And absentee voters had to provide a copy of their photo ID, their Ohio driver's license or ID number, or the last 4 digits of their Social Security number. This bill has also shortened the ballot receipt and ballot cure deadlines. How has, after the successful run of 2022 midterm elections, can you explain how Ohio's existing election integrity laws and the addition of HB 458 will improve election administration?
Thank you so much, Mr. Loudermilk. Really appreciate the question. Ohio wants to continue to innovate and to lead. We have a heritage of doing that. And one of the things that this bill does, of course, as you said, is require a mandatory photo ID. We also included in this bill a provision that allows any Ohioan that can't afford one to get an ID for free, or if you're part of a religious group that doesn't believe in being photographed, then you can sign an affidavit to state as much. And so, of course, we believe that this will increase participation because we think that Ohioans will trust their elections even more than they already have. 75% of Ohioans in repeated polling have said that, of course, you should prove your identity with a photo ID when you come to vote, just like for so many other aspects of life. And we're working right now to implement that bill, and it will be in place for the spring primary that's coming up here in just a month in the state of Ohio, despite the fact that activist groups from out of state are trying to sue us to block the implementation of that bill.
Well, thank you very much. Secretary Ordon, did I pronounce that properly?
Ardwin.
Ardwin. Okay, my wife's from Louisiana, so I knew that there would be multiple ways that could be pronounced. So
You should hear my own people pronounce it.
I'm good friends with Jeff Landry, so I understand. Louisiana's election law features several strong voter integrity measures, just like my home state of Georgia. Louisiana law requires voters to present photo identification, to vote in person, prohibits ballot harvesting, and doesn't allow same-day voter registration. We're seeing that more people have confidence in the process in Georgia. How have these measures affected election administration in your state?
We have not seen a negative impact. Of course, Louisiana has had required photo ID since 1997, and it was pre-cleared by the Clinton administration's Department of Justice. We accept any form of state ID or any form of ID that has a picture and a signature on it. So it's not limited just to a state ID, but we also provide free IDs for individuals who can't afford one. The ballot harvesting has only increased the confidence in our elections, and we passed it, and a Democratic governor signed it into law prior to the presidential election of 2020. We had a robust turnout of 70.1% in that particular election, so we haven't seen any negative impacts.
Well, thank you for that. And I'll just say the feedback I hear from people in Georgia from both parties is it's okay if my neighbor votes differently than me and cancels my vote, but it's not okay if somebody who's not supposed to vote cancels my vote. I yield back.
All right, so at this time, the members of the committee need to head over to the floor to vote. We will then return and reconvene this hearing shortly. We'll shoot for around 10:20 to be back in this chamber. The committee stands in recess, subject to the call of the chair. The Subcommittee on Elections will come to order. Welcome back, everyone. I now recognize Mr. Morelli for 5 minutes for the purpose of questioning our witnesses.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank the witnesses for being here and for testifying and for all of your good work. I do want to state my extreme disappointment that Mr. LaRose is not here. I'm not sure what the taxpayers of Ohio invested in his visit to Washington, but the fact that he couldn't stay for 90 minutes with us to come on the sole topic on which I'm sure he was here in Washington is very, very disappointing, particularly since he has appeared on panels about they stole it legally, and I had a number of questions for him, not the least of which is that a disparity between black and white voters in terms of turnout in Ohio being 35% is the problem that seems to me he ought to be working on the most. If he really truly believes what he said in his testimony relative to Thomas Jefferson's quote about consent of the governed, I think he should have taken a little more care in planning his schedule so he can be with us. I'd hate to think that his leaving early was an effort to avoid any questions about what's happening in Ohio. So I want that in the record. I'm extremely disappointed and feel like it was an effort to evade questioning by this panel. But I do want to thank the witnesses who managed to stay with us for this period of time and thank them for what they do. If I could just start, and I apologize if I do this wrong, Secretary Ardoin. I wonder if you could tell me, do you believe Joe Biden won the 2020 election?
I do believe he won.
You do. Mr. Anderson, do you believe Joe Biden won the 2020 election?
Yes.
Mr. Hewitt, do you believe Joe Biden won the 2020 presidential election?
Wearing my nonpartisan hat, yes, I do.
Well, thank you. I did have a couple questions just from the testimony. Secretary Ardoin, what happened prior to 2014 relative to statewide elections? I noticed in your testimony you said since 2014 you've successfully carried out 9 statewide elections in a row. What happened prior to that? Why were they unsuccessful?
They weren't unsuccessful. We just didn't have elections that were back to back to back. For whatever reason, we had special elections and issues that were put on the ballot by the legislature. And so it was, we basically have 4 elections each year, and we usually had 1 year off, and we haven't had that since that time.
Oh, I see. What you meant to say, what you were talking about is the fact that you've had statewide elections in each of those 9 years.
Correct.
Oh,
Yes,
I'm
sir.
sorry. Okay. So how do you define ballot harvesting?
Ballot harvesting would be collecting of ballots by individuals that aren't in control of, that aren't the voter themselves. Our law outlawed it for political candidates, political parties, nonprofits, 501c3s, 501c4s, and political parties.
Are prohibited in
Are
Louisiana?
prohibited, that's correct.
So if you're a nursing home operator and a number of individuals filled out ballots and it was collected by the nursing home to be sent in or to be delivered to the Board of Elections, would that be considered ballot harvesting?
That would be, yes, sir.
Interesting. I also wanted to ask, since you made a significant point in your testimony, how many non-citizens were registered to vote prior to your constitutional amendment in Louisiana?
I don't know how you track non-citizens because the federal government doesn't provide us any information with regards to that.
But you have a constitutional amendment prohibiting non-citizens from registering. How do you, are you required to show proof of citizenship now to register to vote in Louisiana?
Yes, sir.
You're required to show proof of citizenship.
Yes, sir.
Are you purging non-citizens?
Only when we get notice from the federal judiciary in our state or the local judiciary that someone filled out a card saying they couldn't serve because they were a non-citizen.
But you don't, you have an estimate of how many non-citizens were voting in Louisiana?
I do not.
Okay.
If I may, Congressman, the constitutional amendment prevents any local governing authority to allow non-citizens to vote in their elections. It was already in the Constitution that non-citizens couldn't vote.
In Louisiana.
in Louisiana.
Gotcha. I had a question. You talked about, you said our state utilizes a top-down approach to the administration, preparation, execution of elections, and you talked a little about how important that is. Do you think that's important for the federal government to take a top-down approach, or does that only apply to states?
I think it should only apply to states.
What's the difference between the two governments that you'd think a top-down approach at state governments is superior to a top-down approach from the federal government when it comes to federal elections?
Because I think states should be sovereign with regards to elections.
I'm sorry, I only have 5 minutes. I appreciate your testimony, and I'll submit questions in writing. Thank you, Madam Chair. I yield back.
Thank you. Again, I'd like to thank our witnesses for joining us here today and for sharing more.
I think we have additional witnesses or
My
members.
apologies. Ms. Torres, I did not see you come in the room. I now recognize Ms. Torres for 5 minutes for the purpose of questioning our witnesses.
Thank you. Mr. Hewitt, thank you for being here to discuss the successes and the challenges of the 2022 midterm election. I appreciate the work that you're doing to advocate for communities across our country. In your testimony, you discuss how states across the country are enacting rules that prevent people who have the right to vote from voting, and rules that lead to problems for election workers. In my opinion, our ability to vote shouldn't depend on the type of job that you have, whether or not you have access to a vehicle to drive miles and miles to get to your polling place. Access to childcare. You shouldn't have to drag your kids if you don't want to. When I was a child, I enjoyed going because they had a youth vote ballot where we can vote for in presidential elections. That's not the case anymore. Or the ability to stand in line for 12 plus hours. So in that vein, what are can you speak more about some of the challenges that you are seeing as states across the country begin to change some of their laws?
Certainly. We're seeing basic election administration challenges, lines that are so long that people who have to go back to work or go to a second job or go pick up their children find themselves in this catch-22. Do I use and exercise my democratic rights, or do I take care of my children to make sure I have a roof over my head? That is an unfair choice. We're seeing, I believe Secretary Erdogan we testified together in the Senate last year, we're out of paper. Can't vote today, or can't vote, or can't get the backup today because you're out of paper. We're also, however, seeing these tricky requirements. Well, your signatures don't match, or the signature you used on this ballot doesn't match the absentee or mail ballot doesn't match what you had on your driver's license.
I have tendinitis. My signature never matches my previous signature.
Right, exactly, right. I wonder how doctors do with that, right, with their handwriting, right? So, but also this thing of, well, you didn't write the date. And which data do you write? Do you write the date that you actually submit the ballot, or the date that is your date of birth? These types of confusions are unnecessary, and it makes me think about poll taxes, literacy tests, allegedly facially neutral means, but knowing full well that we're going to trick people into not being able to vote. It's almost like an entrapment of democracy.
So let's now talk about the workers. It used to be very pleasurable into a polling place for me and see my neighbors working and volunteering there. They know who I am, not because I was a councilwoman, a mayor, or a state representative, or now a member of Congress. They know who I am because I shop at the same grocery stores. I, go to the same fast food places, and my kids play with their grandchildren in the same team. So when I have had to go to a different city to vote because last minute my polling place was closed, that has an impact on me, and it has an impact on the election workers also. But misinformation has had the biggest input, the biggest problems, has caused the biggest problems for our election workers. The threats that they are receiving as a result of that disinformation. Can you speak about the mass exodus that we are seeing of these types of workers that traditionally have been the friendliest faces that we have seen?
You're so right, Congresswoman. I know in the community where I grew up, it was the people who lived there who administered elections at the very precinct level. We're losing too many good people. We're losing people who have institutional memory. We're losing people who have relationships and who convey trust, right, in the process.
Or the experience and the proper training.
Right, or experiencing proper training is a challenge. You know, Secretary Erdogan talked about the voter ID requirement in Louisiana. The actual other part of that is that you don't have to have ID to vote in Louisiana. You can submit a written affidavit in lieu of that ID. But do the people at the precincts know that because they're brand new and they've been told otherwise?
I'm going to interrupt you for a minute because I had a devastating fire in my home in 2005. I lost everything that I own, including my wallet, which carried my license and everything. Tried to get a duplicate of that ID in a quick, turnaround time.
If I may-
understand that I am over my time, but I yield back, and I hope to continue to have this conversation with you.
Thank you. Again, I'd like to thank our witnesses for joining us today and for sharing more about how their states are administering free, accurate, and fair elections and working to build voter confidence around our country. While there will always be areas for improvement, I'd like to once again commend the majority of states and localities that ran smooth midterm elections and are working so hard to advance the causes of voter access and election integrity. I will note for the record that Secretary LaRose was able to stay longer, but due to our unanticipated recess to go and vote, he did leave. Otherwise would have been here for Mr. Morelli's question period. When we identify areas for improvement, our states and localities and voters are leading the charge to make elections work better. And as we've learned today, the states that have implemented safeguards have been successful both in rebuilding trust in our elections process and in building increased voter turnout. I look forward to continuing the conversation with all of you and with elections administrators and officials from other states around our country to work to keep information flowing between states without the need for the federal government to get in the way of effective elections administration. Ultimately, I hope more states will follow the lead of Florida, Ohio, Louisiana, those states that have set the standard even higher and higher and continue to review their own processes to identify ways we can make elections better and better. As we say, easy to vote, hard to cheat. Members of the subcommittee may have some additional questions for our witnesses, and we ask that you please respond to those questions in writing. Without objection, each member will have 5 legislative days to insert additional material into the record or to revise or extend their remarks. If there's no further business, I thank the members for their participation, and without objection, the committee stands adjourned.
Review Act, which one of my colleagues mentioned, is the method by which we can do that. It's not just the House that can do that on its own, but instead we have to pass a resolution to disapprove the rule, then we have to send it to the Senate, they have to disapprove the rule, and then it goes to the President, and he must sign that joint resolution from Congress to undo that rule. Isn't that correct, Professor Hammond?
I believe the rule does not go into effect without that. So it indeed undoes the rule.
But without that process happening, effectively, a veto that must require disapproval by the House and the Senate, and then to the President, who oversees and ostensibly is directing the very rulemaking that we're trying to overrule, we can't prevent it from going into place. Isn't that true?
Are you speaking about the REINS Act as proposed, or are you speaking about the Congressional Review Act?
Congressional Review Act.
Yes, it is in place.
Yeah, and I'm saying this, the point I'm trying to make here is effectively we can't undo what an administrative agency is actually going to put in place unless we get through that whole process. And it's nearly impossible because it turns on its head the lawmaking responsibility of Congress, because instead of us having some almost impossible veto power over an agency, we should be, in fact, be in the primary place to put those rules in place to begin with, or to enact those laws. I want to go back to Ms. Ho. I have just a minute. If we work to eliminate the Chevron standard, I want you to speak more to what you believe should be the replacement standard there.
Certainly, I think the replacement is the foundational principle of the judiciary, and that is, it is the province of the judiciary to say what the law is. So I think that would be a return to the bedrock principle and the proper putting the judiciary as well in its proper sphere of operation in our system of separation of power and checks and balances.
Thank you. It seems so simple, doesn't it? Separation of powers. It's not a complex concept, but over time, again, I think both parties have eroded that. And unfortunately, we're having to deal with that today. Mr. Wolfson, non-compete clauses, just with 15 seconds, are an integral part, in my opinion, to protecting confidential and proprietary information for businesses, generating innovation and investment. Do you agree with that?
I think there are places where non-compete clauses make a lot of sense. There's probably other places that they don't make a lot of sense. For example, there's some examples of, for example, fast food restaurants that may require line workers to have a non-compete. I think that there's a great policy discussion that we should be having about this, but the place to have those kinds of policy discussions is in the halls of Congress, or more appropriately, actually, is in the halls of the individual legislatures of the states, who can evaluate in their particular states, are non-compete clauses being used appropriately or not.
I completely agree. I yield back. Thank you.
The gentleman yields back, and I now recognize myself for 5 minutes. We've had a great discussion today about the structure and nature of our republic, and actually how far we've wandered afield from our original founders' intent of having separation of powers. So much power has been concentrated within the executive that actually the lobbyists have gone there now. I don't see many lobbyists here today very concerned about what we're doing. They're all over at the executive branch and at the administration. And in fact, under the Obama White House, Google was co-resident. They hired high-level Google people to run the patent board, to sit inside the White House. So I reject this notion that somehow the executive branch is immune to lobbying. But we've been at a very high level for the most part today, and that's what's made this a really good hearing. We've talked about the structure and nature of government. But Mr. Kleckner, I want you to boil this down to the specific example of a recent rule on the pistol brace and what that means, how many people it's going to affect. Are these civil infractions or criminal infractions? Can you tell us about the pistol brace rule, when it goes into effect, and what the consequences are of letting an agency write law?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I've heard plenty today about profits over people, and I think we're putting regulations over people. I don't think we're keeping people safe with more regulations. In fact, I think regulations and rules like the pistol brace one are actually making it more dangerous. On one hand, I love the maxim that every bit of gun control is a claim that gun control doesn't work because they want more gun laws. On the other hand, I see all these regulations are making felons out of otherwise law-abiding citizens. So you asked how many. The Congressional Research Service estimates between 10 and 40 million of these are out there. Most of these Americans do not know that this rule is happening, and even the Americans that do know the rule is happening cannot interpret it, because the ATF is using vague, ambiguous language with weights similar to this, with a surface area suitable for that. These citizens cannot make these determinations on their own, and we're talking about a piece of plastic that was previously approved by the ATF, that people bought maybe even unknowingly. It might have come on the firearm already, and they're going to be made into felons. This is 18 U.S.C. law that ATF is trying to redefine and trying to rewrite, and serious crimes, confusing regulations, going back and forth. I don't see how that's helping anybody.
And when does this take effect? When was it announced? When does it take effect? Is the government undergoing an ad campaign on TV right now telling millions of people they're going to become felons in a few weeks?
No, sir. It was technically published in the Federal Register, but they had 90
Oh, I hit
days.
refresh on that page every day.
Exactly right. This has changed. They approved these. Another thing we have with the guidance letters is they've been giving separate guidance to each manufacturer. They're not even giving consistent guidance to the industry on what they're allowed to do, so it's conflicting information. That was 2012. A few years later, you couldn't shoulder them. A couple years later, you could. It changes so much, I don't know how someone's gonna be able to keep up with what's going on.
But the people who are going to become felons by virtue of an agency making law because there's a different president who hates guns, weren't they assuming, and weren't the manufacturers assuming? Why did they assume it was legal to do what they were doing until this rule went into effect?
They were specifically told by the ATF that it was legal and that they could proceed. And matter of fact, most of these manufacturers have their version of the letter from the ATF on their website that said, these are legal. See, the ATF said it. Some of them even include a copy in the product in the boxes. So all these Americans relied upon the ATF telling them it was good to go, and now they may not even know that it's not. And they're risking being a felon, which, as you know, takes away their right to have any firearm once they're a felon.
It seems like our founders were really wise to put the legislative function in this chamber and in the Senate because we're up for re-election so frequently. But also, I have constituents. We haven't said today, nobody said today that there should be no regulations. My constituents say, just don't change them on me. Let me know what the rules are. Our founders said, the way they set it up required 4 concurrent majorities for a law to change. Think about how intelligent that is. The House had to agree, a House majority, a Senate majority had to agree, and a majority of the Electoral College had to agree in order for a president to sign that bill, and then it had to pass the Supreme Court. How many majorities are required to approve of a bureaucrat changing a law or a rule? As Mr. Moran pointed out, they're not subject to anybody's approval, any voter's approval. Now, you might say the Supreme Court. Okay, the Supreme Court has to approve the regulation, but as Ms. Ho and Mr. Wolfson has pointed out, with Chevron deference, even that majority doesn't have to agree because we'll just defer to the regulators on this. So I think we need to get back to our founders' intent and put the lawmaking authority back in this body. With that, seeing no other members, that concludes today's hearing. We thank the witnesses for appearing before the committee today. We know this takes a lot of time to fly here, to prepare for this, and to put yourself through this. So we appreciate all of you very much for being here and helping us come to an answer, because the answer should come from Congress. It should, on who makes the laws, and I hope we all agree we should be making the law. Without objection, all